My name's Jeremy Till. I'm head of Central St Martin's and was the initiator of this set of events. First of all, I just want to thank all our speakers. I think it's been an amazing day and incredibly generous and open, and I think that the fact it's been captured, there are little bits which I want to get out again and repeat, those that have been missed. I particularly want to thank Lee Widows and Peter Cleek, who I can't see, who have been the orchestrators and brought this extraordinary bunch of people together, and to Alison for hosting it today. When I first thought about this set of events, I wanted to get a multiple set of voices, because there's no single answer to this question. That's absolutely apparent. And I think that today has been a fantastic multiplicity of voices from all ends of the spectrum. And I've now got the task of trying not to summarize it, because I think that would be an impossible task, but I suppose to justify why I set the question in the first place and possibly to reach some provisional answers. The reason I set the question was purely political. Political in three senses of the word. Political with a capital P, political in the feminist sense of the personal as political, and political in the original sense of the term as polis, as city, as collective, and as ethic. So if I take those three in order, I'll start with political with a capital P. I'm slightly nervous of doing this because I think Shelley's incredibly acute and articulate account of the situation is more meaningful than a old Etonian, Cambridge-educated, white male, hierarchical person could ever possibly be. But I will try anyway. When I took over this extraordinary job in this extraordinary place, in this extraordinary institution, I took it over at a time when it might be seen that this government was doing everything possible to take away those extraordinary virtues. The imposition of the £9,000 fee on the basis of a bunch of neoliberal cant, which was talking about we can't afford it, even though it's costing more, which was talking about everyone should pay the same, etc., etc. That, as has already been talked about, has had a profound effect on the perception of art schools. And I think that that debate needs to be stated again and again and again. At the time, we had a Secretary of State for Arts, who is better known for a slip of rhyming slang rather than for what he did for the arts, and now has been dispatched the more important task of shutting down the NHS. And then, at the same time, we have austerity measures, which it doesn't take a great economic genius to read, are more to do with the imposition of an ideological program rather than an actual economic rationale. And as we heard this morning, those austerity measures are already having profound effects on the access to education and potentially even more on access to art school. So that's when I took over the job. And since then, it's become like if you had written the script, you couldn't have invented some of the things that have come out. You could not have invented the statement on the national curriculum for art and design. Well, you could have if you were in the 1850s. Let me just remind you once again how it reads. Art and design education should instill in pupils an appreciation of beauty, an awareness of how creativity depends on technical mastery. It is pathetic, but actually it's also very dangerously pathetic because of the reductive nature of what art and design is described as there. And in that very reductive nature, it becomes so easy, as many people have said today, to marginalise it. And I'm very glad that this university took a leading role through Ian's work in making a very articulate and profound response to that. Then we have Maria Miller. We've talked about her today as well. And it is again worth repeating that as soon as you use the word commodity, then we are in a state of severe challenge. That because the only thing that you can do with commodities is buy and sell them and exchange them, art then gets reduced to simply part of the market mechanism. And so the very first answer to the question, what's the point of art school, is that we collectively have to stand up very politically to this government and successive governments to articulate exactly what the point is, and also, as Shelley did very, very clearly, to take a very political stance about what these policies are doing. And if you think that it is wrong for a pro-vice-chancellor, of all people, to take such a political stance, we need to do it because of the acquiescence of the university sector when these new policies were coming in. Not just the acquiescence, but in some places, the complicit nature of the Russell Group, who saw more money coming down the line through the £9,000 fee. And the other thing that we need to do, as Shelley mentioned this morning, is stand together on this. Because there's a kind of divide and rule thing, where the students are described disgracefully as consumers, and in that consumption of their education, all they can do is complain, because that's all consumers can do. And in that, you set the students against the universities. So I think that we need very clearly and very boldly to work together in stating to this government and successive governments exactly what the point of art schools are. And to do that in a political way which takes on the values which they are propounding, which are a threat to the very core of the other values which have been talked about so movingly today about what art school can offer. So that's my first political, with a big P. My second political is the political as the personal. And again, we've had a lot of that today, and I take very seriously the personal effect of art school on individual empowerment. And we've heard stories very movingly from Johnny Vegas and from some of the sessions that we had earlier in the other talks 2 weeks ago, in which successively people were recounting the importance of art school to their own experience and their own empowerment. And I count myself as one of those who went through a completely miserablist education at Cambridge in a pseudo-scientific paradigm, and then moved to the Polytechnic of Central London, which was a poor man's AA, which was in turn a kind of most radical architecture school in the world at the time, and discovered myself. So I feel part of that process of individual empowerment, and we lose that at our peril. There is, however, a strange byproduct of the new commercialized world of education. 3 years ago, one of those people who has common sense, i.e. that those kind of awful people in pubs who have common sense, who know how things work, now called UKIP, would have walked past, let's say, the window at the end of Central St. Martin's and seen a spaceman hanging. And they'd said, oh, bloody art students, yeah, all on drugs, that's the only way they can do that kind of work. Do you know what? We're paying for them. And they shouldn't be doing that. Now, that can be abolished because the students are paying for themselves and can do exactly what they want to do. And there is a sort of strange flip side to the consumer society, which the 9K fee does, which it might introduce a set of neo-libertarian values in which choice and freedom of the individual student becomes paramount. And the danger of that is what then that empowerment does at a wider level, at a wider societal level. So although I am proud of the history of this institution in terms of its alumni, I'm worried about just talking about it in terms of its alumni, because that perpetuates a myth of individual empowerment and individual genius. And I think that brings me to the third point, which is that art schools have to be much more than just the sum of individual agencies, however important they may be to the individual. And so the politics of the polis is potentially what the real point of the art school is. In Aristotle's terms, something to do with a moral collective, and maybe in contemporary terms, something to do with contested ethics. And so my call would be that art schools should open up from the very internalized and minor preoccupations, which in their very internalization seem incredibly important, and open up to major preoccupations, societal occupations, and expand outwards. And the argument for that is, if there's ever a time that we need art schools and the thinking of art schools, it's now. I was on my Twitter feed, which is now my sole form of external life, something captured my imagination, which was a statement by Nicholas Negroponte, who was the founder of MIT Media Lab. Just a little tweet, that's why I love Twitter, which said, "Art schools are where all the action is. Business schools are done." And I thought that was really interesting. Not just because we know that business schools are done, because the evidence is so apparent that business schools are done. It's called 2008, and their reaction to it, which was simply a retrenchment of exactly what they'd been doing before. Not just because we know that business schools are done, because their pedagogy is so catastrophically limited and myopic down to the regurgitation of a set of spectacular case studies which students can learn from, and if you learn from that, you can become the next case study. And not just because business schools are done, because their value system is limited simply to the value system of the market. But the business school as a symptom of a wider malaise. And the wider malaise is the clinging to a certain set of paradigms and values. And my argument would be that in a time of environmental apocalypse, and I use that word without trying to be extravagant, and a time of the crisis of capitalism, the paradigms and values of the business school and of the wider set of Enlightenment values which appear to dominate society have been found spectacularly wanting. All we're offered, on the one hand, are technocratic solutions, and on the other hand, the appeal to a set of neoliberal values to do with progress and growth. We only suffer austerity on the promise of future growth. And so these things are accepted as a form of natural order, as if there is no alternative. And that's why the crisis perpetuates right in front of our eyes. I think very strongly that art and design does offer a real alternative to those paradigms. And it is for this reason, and I think this is where it's important, that I think that we have to be much more articulate, as someone has already said, about what we do. There was a session on What's the Point of Art School on art and science in which we were rather patronizingly told that artists are good at communicating scientific ideas. There was a session which Rebecca Wright students at King's College went with her MA Communication Design students to work with researchers. And again, I kind of got a sense that they felt that they were doing us a favor. We were doing them a favor because those students were able to think through research projects in a completely different manner than the paradigms which had been constrictedly put onto the research students they're working with. And I think, therefore, we need to be much clearer about the art school as a productive and constructive mode of research and action. But that only works if we turn that thinking and making, research and acting, whatever you want to call it, outwards, away from the refinement of the object, and outwards to the constitution and the consequences of the object, and the way that that object or our processes engage with the social and political life world. I would argue that art and design schools have been challenging those Enlightenment paradigms of truth and progress and growth, which are then associated with the paradigms of neoclassical economics for quite a long time already. And what we need to do is to articulate them in a much clearer manner. So if I think about the idea of the critical reflexivity of design over the rote reproducibility of science, what we do as designers is we critically reflect on conditions. If we think about the way that creative curiosity is always intellectually restless, it's always lateral against the linearity of rationality. If we think about the way that the processes within art and design education are naturally iterative and thus dynamic, rather than endlessly circling towards a static end. If we think about the way that we all as designers engage with contingency and work with it enjoyably, rather than seeing it as a hindrance to objectivity. If we think about, as Johnny Vegas said, there's not a right or wrong, which is against the idea of searching for a truth. If we think about the way that design, as someone else said earlier today, is always looking for possibilities of the future, rather than, in the Enlightenment paradigm, the refinement of the status quo. Reflexive, restless, contextual, I didn't do contextual, about how our work is always contextual, dealing with the here and now, rather than with the abstract. So if I take those words in order, reflexive, restless, contextual, dynamic, contingent, possible, maybe these are better terms to describe the state of what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity that we all live in, And maybe if there are better terms to describe the condition that we live in, maybe there are better terms to understand how we might deal with that condition, as opposed to the words of reproduction, linearity, abstraction, stasis, objectivity, and refinement, on which the paradigm of the Enlightenment still dominates and is still with us. And so, although it may be easy to, I always work in a sort of dialectic manner like that, there's this and there's that. What I was really pleased about was that Amanda Bright did a session with Central St. Martin's students and staff and said, what issues should we be dealing with? And the issues that emerged were exactly in line with these modes of thinking. They were issues of disruptive technologies, of the democratization of innovation, of no more stuff, the ethics of design, and of always thinking beyond one's own discipline, which is different from all the other stuff of multidisciplinary stuff, which I think is just guilt. So my point is, there's both a will and the means for a place like Central St. Martin's and a university like the University of Arts to expand its horizons, to use what it already is doing, but to use it in a much more expansive, productive, and positive manner in terms of the public good. And not to see us as mere visualizers, or as wacky creators, or as individual mavericks, but working towards the common good. But to do that, I think that we need to be more confident, articulate, and political about what we can offer. And I think that today has begun to do exactly that. Thank you. Right, that is the end of the day. Not quite, though. There are a number of things going on. The first is that Anna Hart is available just as you come out to take people on silent walks, which go on for 40 minutes, and they take you around the building and the environment, and they are silent and they reflect on some of the things that we've been talking about today. So Anna is outside. Secondly, we would like to gather together, those of you who are not on the silent walk, in a photo outside in solidarity with the occupation at Cooper Union. And then after that, there are drinks. Thank you.